And I'm not saying that conservatives are like Islamic extremists. But there is research on Islamic extremists, and they have very low complexity in terms of how they view the world. All right, so you analyze Osama bin Laden's speeches. Okay, it's us and them, us and them, us and them. So they have basically an intervention where they try to make them less extreme, and the way they do it is to show them that there's other kinds of Islam than just this one kind. All right, and then the infidels or whatever. There's all these other Muslims that don't agree with Osama, and that's the program, and it apparently works. And it's called integrative complexity, teaching people that to see issues as complex and to try to integrate the different perspectives. That has been shown to work in that context. So it's not a leap to say that that's the kind of thing that works to break down black and white.
I just want to say I think it's really funny that that question came from a chemistry professor.
Well,
I think maybe you should
I know,
do some
and the
research.
chemistry professor. Wait, let me say one more thing. The reason that alcohol is probably doing this, okay, is it's inducing closure. I mean, it's making you have less time or need to think through a lot of things, so you're more just acting quickly, all right? So you're just finding closure more quickly, and it turns out the conservative ideas like people should have their own property that should be absolute. These are just easier things to close upon, right? So you would also want something that would prevent closure, right? Or induce the lack of closure, induce open-mindedness. And so again, I see where you're going, right? Theoretically, I think that would probably work. Yeah.
You've caused me great emotional anguish.
Why?
I now feel compelled to go home and mess up my closet.
Now, these are only correlations, right? Now, you might be liberal and have a clean closet. And like I said, I'm one of these rigid, structured liberals, like on time, all right? Adam, who works with me, Adam Isaac, he can probably attest to that. So it must be really annoying to many of the people that I work with. Yes?
People have been blowing gaskets about Edwina Rogers at the Secular Coalition. Is it her name Rogers?
Who?
Is it Edwina Rogers? Republican, the new...
oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes,
yeah.
I do remember that.
Yes. I look down our list here and I see free thought, I see free speech, one might add freedom of conscience, academic freedom, and I see an immediate connection with the individualist side of the spectrum, and it strikes me that that's an underexploited frame for our
possibly
outreach.
Possibly. I mean, it's clear that the very individualist conservative is a different beast than the hierarchical conservative. But many conservatives are both. All right, and someone who's hierarchical is not going to be cool. I mean, but I want to show you something else, right? And I didn't talk about it, but when you break it down, in this way, based on personality and left-right, what's really important to notice is that when you look at openness, and this is people who are open-minded, open to trying new things, new ideas, they want to go out and see a bunch of new places in the world, all right? You got overall ideology, you got economic ideology, and you got social ideology. And they're all showing this big liberal effect, okay? So that means, okay, what essentially that's saying to me is that these economic conservatives, sometimes they claim to be libertarian, sometimes they claim to be individualist, they're less open, okay? Right? Openness predicts economic liberalism, okay? It's like a Paul Krugman kind of view of economics. It's not a libertarian view of economics. So what is that saying to us? To me, that's saying that this economic right and this social right are tied together in a way that people kind of ignore, all right? Because, openness is predicting both kinds of left, economic and social. So I think that's, and I would argue further that this traditionalist idea about the economy, which is Republican or individualist, which is, everybody gets ahead or falls behind based on their own merits. That's a fair system. The government doesn't help. Who needs government? You need to do it on your own, which is individualism. It's kind of a simple conservative mantra that becomes a dogma. Yeah. Well, David Brooks is just sort of a moderate to me, right? Yeah. It's also not the Edmund Burke kind of conservatism. I mean, it's not intellectual conservatism, which basically in the United States doesn't really apply to conservatism anymore. Yeah. Question?
I really appreciate your presentation. This has
Thank you.
been like a eureka moment for me to understand their defective DNA and their mutant genes.
They're not mutant genes. I mean, this is clearly, I want to emphasize that, and then I'll take your question, right? I don't believe that we differ in this way by accident. I don't have a full evolutionary theory for why. You know, someone like Jonathan Haidt is getting closer to it, and maybe even E.O. Wilson. But I don't think that we have these aspects of our nature because they're bad for us. Rather, I think that, you know, being able to make up your mind quickly, following a strong leader, supporting the group, these are all things that are probably with us for a reason, right? So, anyway.
Well, my question was, if conservatives and Republicans have this genetic or DNA, is it
Let's
expressed?
call it personality mostly.
All right, personality.
Yeah.
Is it expressed with the emotion of fear? It seems to me that is the main.
Well, fear causes this really strong need for closure, all right? And this is
Right.
why even fear will
It
make...
seems to me that's their basic emotion, is their fear of openness, their fear of diversity, their fear of
It's a very powerful
change.
emotion. Yeah. But another emotion that's really strongly associated with conservatism is disgust. Okay? So I find that disgusting. Right? Including, you know, I find your sexual behavior disgusting. I find your long hippie hair disgusting. Right? I mean,
because they fear it.
well, yeah, but it's a different emotion if you measure it in the body, right? It's probably coming from a different place. So it's not like one emotion, but I agree. There's this deep fear conservative connection, and you know, I think it's one of the most important things in all of political psychology to say that when people are operating under fear, they shift conservative because they want quick, easy answers that give them closure and make them feel safe again. And in that context, a strong leader who makes decisive statements, divides the world up into black and white, that's who they want, and that's really dangerous. Right. But it's in a time when you're being attacked that you are most susceptible to it, right? And you look at human history and see how many times you see that story.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. I was wondering if you could comment on some research that I read about. I don't have a smartphone, so I can't pull it up. But the title talked about evolutionarily novel traits, especially in men, that show up more often in progressives and atheists. Traits like male monogamy, and just, I can't remember quite all of them, but they were a lot to do with openness. And they found those to be correlated. And I was wondering if you had heard about it, could comment on it. It came out, I think, probably about 6 months ago.
I feel like I haven't heard of that.
Okay.
So I wouldn't know what to say about it.
Keywords to look for would just be evolutionarily novel traits, and also.
And they
atheism
include male monogamy?
Yeah, and they included like atheism and a couple other things, non-religious, being secular. Those were things that were included in there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. You know, clearly, part of this analysis is that, you know, what I'm calling the quote conservative side of humanity. You know, I didn't talk that much about groupishness, but it's implied here. You know, supporting the group, supporting the tribe. I mean, that's clearly something that comes from who we are evolutionarily, right? And it's more, but we seem to vary on it. Okay, it's not like everybody is the same amount tribal. Conservatives, you know, tend to be more tribal, and religion tends to bind the tribe together. And the question is, why do we have this variability where not everybody needs that as much as everybody else? And that's what the answer is not clear to. So if there are evolutionary novel traits, which, you know, I'm sure there are, the question still is, why do human beings have this diversity? Was the diversity itself good to have, or is it just an accident that we just vary? You know, is this noise? But the noise is creating political differences, and I don't know the answer to that.
Have there been any studies done on siblings, say within, siblings, some who turn out to be liberals and some conservatives, where they would really share certain genetic
Well, they do.
background and they would share somewhat the same environment?
That is how we study this, right? But we study twins. We study twins and we study identical versus fraternal, right? And that's how you determine that's one of the most accepted ways of determining how strongly inherited a trait is. And so it turns out that on any trait that has a genetic component, the identical twins are more similar to one another than the conservative twins when you study big groups of twins, right? Like height, right? But who knew until recently that politics is one of them, right? And that they estimate from the twin study models that, something like 40% of the variance in your political views is genetic, because that's basically the difference between identical and fraternal twins. And the same thing for personality, and the same thing for conservative religiosity. So it's clearly something's traveling in the genome that, obviously it comes out and gets expressed in all kinds of different contexts, but something's traveling in the genome that's producing these different kinds of traits that end up being ideological. Okay, yeah.
You put up the picture of the Apple slogan.
Yeah.
That you said appeals primarily to liberals. And let me say first that I'm not a Mac user. But what would it say about me politically if I think that it ought to say "think differently," other than that I've been an editor for 4 years?
I'm just curious, how many people
I
in
don't
this
know,
room,
because that's a very conscientious thing to say.
I mean, how many people in this room are bothered by the lack of ly on that slogan?
Well, I think that's also, if I could hypothesize, I told you about the anterior cingulate cortex and the error detector, and you're detecting an error, right? And it's ticking you off. And the anterior cingulate thing suggests that some people are going through life and they're not detecting as many errors that tick them off, in a sense. And so... yeah.
That's why I refuse to use a Mac.
Yes?
Well, I'll point out, I'm pretty sure that's not a Mac.
No, it's not. I don't use Macs, actually.
I'm going to sort of break the frame here and test something you said, and very quickly, and I'll explain why later if anybody cares. I'd like people to raise their hands to say whether they're for or against the death penalty. For.
You're a bunch of liberals. Look at this. Give a straight answer.
No. Against.
Most of you are against the death penalty. Most of you, because most of you are liberals and you're not authoritarians. Okay. Authoritarians love the death penalty.
The reason I'm asking is that I asked CFI to support an effort against the death penalty, and I was told that it was a very mixed. CFI people had very mixed feelings about it.
Well, I bet you most people who support CFI are against the death penalty, and I think that these kinds of views travel with atheism and with liberalism. But there's also probably some people who thought that was not the kind of issue that, necessarily is right at the front burner of the things that the organization does. Right. Yeah. Okay. Any other? Are we going to do more? Yeah.
If you don't mind. I'm glad that question came up because it has bearing on what I wanted to ask you. I love your work on framing. This I'm having more trouble with, and I think perhaps if you had included the genetic data, it would have been more convincing to me from the outset, because I think the real problem with your hypothesis is the causal claim that you're making that was not justified by any of the data that you presented in your actual talk. I think the twin studies are more interesting. But the death penalty example is a real key problem, I think, for this hypothesis you're advancing. Because if the hypothesis is that some people, largely due to genetic differences, or even very significantly due to genetic differences, have different personalities which then feed into quite specific policy positions like support or not for the death penalty, then you have a real problem with countries like Britain and other countries in Europe, where a huge swathe of the population are against the death penalty, regardless of their political persuasion, whether conservative or liberal. And so if you look at something like a British conservative, what's called a conservative in Britain, and you tally their political positions, you get someone who is in support of government-funded healthcare for everybody, who is in support of gay marriage, and who takes some positions which are well to the left of American Democrats, right? And these are the people who you are saying share the same sort of correlated traits in terms of their psychology. Now that suggests to me that there isn't a very strong link between particular political positions and the psychological traits you're identifying. So what's going on there then?
Well, so there's two assertions. First, you're making a correlation causation argument, objection, I think.
I do object.
Well, I don't know. The causation is in both directions.
Right.
But clearly some of it is from the genetics, or else why would we have the genetic differences? But some of it, obviously the culture can feed in and drive the differences, right? So watching Fox News changes your brain.
Yes.
Okay? And it changes your brain in a conservative way.
But your presentation was not particularly clear about that. I have to say it presented to me at least a rather
we have
unidirectional picture.
The causation is in both directions.
To introduce an extraordinarily important part of your argument.
What?
I mean, you should present the picture as a bidirectional causational flow right from the start.
Because you're asking the question like a liberal wonk who wants that detail, but most of my audience doesn't actually. So I mean,
wow, that's very dishonest.
But the other point is that you just have cultural differences. You have cultural differences. You have nature differences playing out in different cultures. And, in the UK, you have a dramatically different, among other things, communication system. And you have a dramatically different history. So obviously, it plays out very, very differently. But, that said, I think that we know, based on some of the Europe research I put up, that, politics and left-right personality do correlate in Europe in the same direction that they correlate in the United States. All right, that doesn't mean you have to have an authoritarian conservatism in England, okay? Because for a lot of reasons that we could discuss, and you probably know better than me, it didn't evolve that way. I bet you if you look back in British history, you'll find authoritarianism, and so I think that's my answer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
My name is Amanda Knief. I work for American Atheists, and I'm a big fan of CFI. I loved your presentation. I just want to nitpick one little thing.
Okay.
And that's that you kind of laughed and you said maybe you don't want to try to communicate with people who are Republican brain. And as someone who worked in Washington and had to work with Republicans, because otherwise you have to just knock out half the government, I just wanted to say don't give up on them. And I really like the fact that you went into framing, because framing is a really great way. And for example, if you go in and say I'm an atheist and I need you to give me my rights, they're just going to slam the door in your face. But if you go in and say I'm here to protect everyone's rights, and if you're Catholic, I want to protect everyone from evangelicalism, or if you're evangelical, do you really want the Pope telling you what to do? You get their attention. So that's one really great way we framed, and I didn't even know what it was called until you told me tonight, but it worked really well. So he's giving you some really good tools, so please don't give up on them, because they're half the country, and even though they're crazy,
but they're not half the country, all right? There's a middle, and the middle is going to have more of a blend of left-right traits than the right, and so actually I would argue, no, I agree, you shouldn't give up on them, but I'm telling you, the middle's going to be a heck of a lot easier.
Sure, until a plane hits a building.
Well, yeah, I mean,
yes.
But the other thing about reaching the middle that this research shows is that psychologically, you can't let all your liberal side hang out when you want to reach the middle, because these people are often partly conservative, right? So they're not going to want wishy-washy. They're going to want, quick answers. They're going to want strong defense. I mean, they're going to have a lot of traits that aren't on the far left. So that's going to have to be modulated, or else you don't reach the middle. Because I do believe that a lot of them are a blend, and they move. But thank you for your comment.
When I first came to work for CFI, we had a brochure, and right on the front of it, it said, "You've got answers, we've got questions." And
Yes,
thought,
exactly.
Who the hell wants more questions?
Some people actually do. Some people
Right, of
resist
course.
closure.
Right.
Right? They just won't do it.
I was moving up the side of the room. Are there more questions? Chris, do you mind giving us a few more minutes?
No, it's fine.
This is great. More? All right.
So I was wondering about, you said a lot about liberals being pro-science, but there are also liberals who are anti-science, New Agers, cultural relativists, people like this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those sorts of groups.
Well, don't you think that when they are anti-science in those ways, it's because of egalitarian communitarianism? I mean, you know, the vaccine issue is such a great example of the kind of thing that appeals to the New Agers, right? Because, you know, it suggests that, you know, there's something wrong with these needles and we need a more warm, fuzzy, caring way of doing medicine and taking care of people. And that's the same, you know, the appeal of alternative medicine is always the same thing, that, you know, there's this medical industry and it's kind of sterile and it doesn't care about people and it doesn't take care of their needs, doesn't make them feel good. I mean, this is, you know, we got to be communicarians, we got to take care of people better. And it's misfiring. All right, and so what you get when that happens, you get that emotional misfiring, then you get a conflict on the left between the scientists who are like, none of this crap is going on in my discipline, right? You know, but then you have the emotional left, and so then you get a fight. But it works out differently than on the right, because the right doesn't have the scientists, and the right tends to be more unified, right? So it's not to say you can't get irrationality, and you get it around all kinds of environmental issues. Right? Nuclear power is one where I think you really get it, because again, you know, you have this egalitarian, communitarian willingness to latch onto a claim that a corporation did bad. So in nuclear, it ends up being this idea that it's not safe. Okay, low doses of radiation are somehow going to get out, and they're going to cause people cancer at long distances. It's going to be invisible stuff. You're never going to know it did it to you, but you're going to have cancer 40 years later, right? And you know, the scientific community does not agree that the risk is that. But if you're in this egalitarian, communitarian, fuzzy mode, I don't trust the corporations, then like that stuff is going to feel more right to you. Okay, and so then again, then the scientists, the physicists who study this are going to be like, no way low-dose radiation can travel over long distances, and then they're right? And then you have a conflict on the left, but then the left changes. And so President Obama is like, let's do more nuclear power. And again, so it's a different dynamic. It doesn't mean that the left is like rational. It's more that it's emotionally wedded, not rationally, emotionally wedded to this sort of enlightenment view of doing things, which is the scientific view. Plus it has these emotional commitments that sometimes get in conflict. But the right is a different beast. The right still ends up being a very different thing. That's how I would put it.
Okay, last question.
So, on a topic that's always baffled me, can you explain libertarians?
Explain libertarians? Woo! Yeah, so I mean, I feel like there needs to be a book about this. God, they will be so angry. You know? But look, let's say I got a friend who jokes that it's because they all have model trains in their basements. No, there's something about libertarian. Let's not deny the obvious. Something male about it. All right? Do you agree with me about that? Okay. Now, what is up with that? I mean, it's this sort of it's this kind of, to me, a real sense of like, you know what? I'm in control. You know, I can make everything work in my life. You know, I can make the trains run on time. I can make a lot of money, and I don't need any help. And everybody should just be like me, you know? Which doesn't make any sense, right? But I mean, you know, but it's feeling that since I'm so competent, we should build society based on me. You know, anyway, that's kind of my beginnings of an explanation of libertarianism.
Is anyone doing research on a chemical to remove that?
The chemical what?
To remove libertarianism.
You know, libertarianism is definitely a growth area for research. I mean, they also have, I mean, you know, this is really, really big to them, okay? You know, the go it alone, the Wild West kind of thing. But I mean, but I really think the maleness and basically, frankly, the testosterone of it is I think, going to be a key component of it because there's such a big gap, gender gap there. So I think that's going to be a key part of it. And if I can just go back here, I'm hypothesizing now, right? We didn't talk about agreeableness. We didn't talk about it. But, what you got here is you got economic is going left, but you got social. Wait, is that what you got? Social going right. And what I think this is, and there's one paper to support it, okay, is that this is kind of politeness and religious communities, really prizing politeness, and that this is empathy, right, and which is caring about all kinds of different people, and that's pushing people left. And empathy is also, women do better on it than men, okay? So, I'm thinking about the gender gap there, and I'm thinking about the role in the relationship between maleness and libertarianism. That's basically where I am. But this is a hypothesis, okay? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.